Joseph, I think, if I had to consider maybe one of my favorite Old Testament Bible characters, it would probably be Joseph in the Old Testament. You can find his story in Genesis 37 through chapter 50 or so, but you remember Joseph. He was the favored son of Jacob, and the coat of many colors, the technicolored dream coat, I guess, if you will. But Joseph, it seemed like much of his life, just one trial after the next. His brothers, threw him in a pit, sold him into slavery in Egypt. And in Egypt, things didn't go much better for Joseph. For many, many years, he was thrown into prison. Potiphar's wife had accused Joseph of made advancements towards Joseph and brought up false accusations against Joseph. And Joseph, again, was thrown into prison. And think about Joseph for a minute. I think if I were Joseph, I'd be like, what's going on? Because Joseph just honored God all the time. Throughout all his trials, throughout all of his struggles, he continued to honor God with his life. And even despite facing consequences from Potiphar's wife, Joseph maintained his integrity and his self-control by refusing her advances. And Joseph said in Genesis 39 and verse 9, "How can I do this great wickedness," speaking about Potiphar's wife, "and sin against God?" Joseph, throughout his life, his commitment is honoring God in all that he does. And Joseph demonstrates remarkable self-control in his life. Our series on Sunday mornings, we're exploring a text from 2 Peter chapter 1 and about verses 5 through 9. And this morning, as we consider that text, we're going to notice some things about self-control. But let's take a moment and just review our text. Again, 2 Peter chapter 1, beginning in verse 5. Peter says, "For this very reason, giving all diligence, add to your faith virtue, to virtue knowledge, and to knowledge self-control. To self-control perseverance, and to perseverance godliness, and to godliness brotherly kindness, and to brotherly kindness love. For if these things are yours and abound, you will neither be barren nor unfruitful in your knowledge of our Lord Jesus Christ. For he who lacks these things is short-sighted, even to blindness, and has forgotten that he was cleansed from his old sins." So we're going to spend a few moments this morning talking about and just looking at self-control. But what do we notice the Apostle Peter sharing here? These things add to your faith. These virtues we need to add to our faith. And one Peter lists here is self-control. He says, if these things are yours and increase, if they're abounding in your lives, this means they're not just something we add, we've got it there, that's good, but these are things that we are to continually be adding to our faith or supplying to our faith. And that is self-control. And self-control is critical to our growth in the Lord. Self-control enables us to resist temptation. Self-control enables us to make wise decisions. Self-control plays a part in our character, in our integrity, in our maturity. And it's also essential for maintaining relationships and healthy relationships. Achieving goals. If we lack self-control, it's very hard to maintain relationships without self-control. It's hard to meet goals that we wish to meet. And it's difficult to honor God. So in 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 6, the Greek word here, as I understand, for self-control, has this meaning of restraining. Restraining our passions, our impulses and desires. It involves controlling ourselves so that we exhibit discipline in various aspects of our life. It conveys this idea of having an inner strength, the ability to control and govern our behavior as we seek to add to our faith and follow the Lord. I think just understanding the meaning for a little bit and thinking about just exactly what it means helps us understand what Peter is stressing in our text and why he wants us to supplement, to add to our faith, self-control. Self-control requires discipline. It requires being intentional. In the book of Proverbs chapter 25 and verse 28, it says, "Whoever has no rule over his own spirit is like a city with broken down walls." Whoever has no rule over his own spirit is like a city broken down without walls. Self-control, in the book of Proverbs, we see it's like a city without walls. And today, that may not mean as much to us as it would have meant in the ancient world or in an ancient culture. But a city without walls in the ancient culture was a city that was defenseless, or at least had very little defense. A city without walls in an ancient culture meant you were very susceptible to attack, to being infiltrated. So in the book of Proverbs, what we learn is whoever is not able to control, to rule over their spirit, it's like that city without walls. You're defenseless, or at least you lack the defenses that you need. You're susceptible to attack when you lack self-control. It's like you're just tossed back and forth by every desire and every lust if we lack self-control in our lives. James says that when each one is tempted, he's drawn away by his own desires and he's enticed. When desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin. Sin, when it's full grown, brings forth death. You see, James teaches us about the harmful effects of sin, but what is he also telling us in this verse? He's also telling us that we need to be discerning about what's tempting us, what's coming into our lives. Each one is tempted when he's drawn away by his own desires and enticed. When desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, brings death. We need to be aware and discerning about what is tempting us and what is coming into our lives that seek to draw us away from serving God. Desires and temptations are usually in a need to gratify ourselves, an immediate gratification. Things that bring us pleasure, things that fulfill our need. And without self-control, we typically just go chasing after those things for our own self-gratification. And what we don't do is ask ourselves, are these things that I desire aligning with God's purposes? Are they aligning with the principles and the will of God? Self-control allows us to say no to things that are destructive, habits, indulgences, temptations that can hinder our growth in the Lord. And by exercising self-control, we can make decisions like Joseph that honored the Lord when we prioritize what truly matters most. You see, Joseph, when he was faced with a choice, when he was in the midst of temptation, what did he realize? God, I realize that if I commit this, I'm sinning against you. My sin is against you, God. And sometimes I think when we are faced with temptation, when we're faced with trials, without self-control, without discerning what's happening oftentimes we can't prioritize what truly matters. Another area that we should focus on when we talk about self-control is the area of our language, our speech. Again, James, and let me just see something real quick. I don't know. Yes. Sorry, Bryn. Slide 13, if you want to jump there. James, in our speech, teaches us something very powerful about our language. Every kind of beast and bird, of reptile and creature of the sea is tamed and has been tamed by mankind, but no one can tame the tongue. It's unruly, evil, full of deadly poison. With it we bless our God and Father, and with it we curse men who have been made in the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceed blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not to be so. And one thing that James recognizes is we have a tendency as people to let our language get away from us, to let our speech get away from us. We both bless God and curse people, curse man who is made in the image of God. But what does he say? These things should not be. We need to maintain self-control in the area of our language. Our words can build up, they can destroy. They can uplift or they can tear down. In our speech, we need to maintain self-control. To speak things that are truthful, to speak things that are kind and respectful towards one another. And I think today, perhaps, our culture struggles with this. We struggle with our speech and being respectful to one another. I don't mean to get on a little soapbox here, but if somebody has a different opinion than we just tear them down. We can't listen. We can't even begin to hear what they may be saying because we so quickly shut down and destroy with our speech. It's a problem that we have in our culture. I remember years ago, times past, people could debate one another and still be friends. Today, we can't debate each other and be friends. We either all agree or we're on opposite teams. Our language needs to be brought under control if we want to honor God. Our emotions and how we react. Sometimes our emotions can be almost unpredictable. They can be intense. And if they're left unchecked, they can lead us astray many times. My wife could tell you that when I was younger, I had a very, very hot temper. It didn't take anything to get me mad really, really fast. And usually when I would lash out in anger, I would hurt someone else or hurt myself. Emotions need to be brought under control, under the will of God. We need to be able to respond with healthy emotions rather than impulsively. We don't need to let anger run our lives, jealousy or fear even to dictate our emotions and our actions. But we need to practice patience, understanding, as we move forward in God's grace. So these are some areas just that we need to consider when it comes to areas of self-control. But how do we develop, how do we cultivate self-control in our lives? I want to give you just a few points, a few things that we can do to cultivate self-control. And this is number one. I think we make this mistake a lot. We think about character development and things such as self-control, and we think it's all about my efforts and my products, what I'm doing. But understand, developing self-control in the life of a Christian is not just about us, but it is also a fruit of the Spirit of God that works within us. Galatians chapter 5 and verses 22 and 23, the Apostle Paul lists several uh, characteristics of the Spirit, the fruit of the Spirit that's produced in the lives of the believer, and also among them are self-control. The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such there is no law. Paul highlights the importance of self-control and relying on the Lord to develop and strengthen our self-control. As we yield to the Spirit's guidance in our lives, He equips us with self-control, self-discipline to resist temptations and make decisions that honor God in our lives. Creating self-control in our lives is going to take an intentional effort. Self-control is a gift of the Spirit, as we read, but it's going to require an active participation in our lives as well. Developing self-control involves being intentional in our discipline and in our effort. It calls us to align our will with the will of God. To align our thoughts, our desires, our actions with the purposes of God. And it requires a willingness to make sacrifices, to delay gratification and persevere even in the midst of challenging situations and circumstances. We can develop strength. We can develop self-control through consistent discipline and reliance on God's grace. The other thing I want to mention as we think about cultivating self-control in our lives is our faith and our dependence upon God. Cultivating self-control is tied to our faith in the Lord and our dependence upon Him. Recognizing our limitations as we acknowledge that true self-control comes from surrendering our will to God's will. You see, a lot of times the struggle is we don't want to give over control. But self-control comes when we surrender our desire and our will to the Lord's will. We deepen that relationship with Him through prayer, through the study of His Word, as we seek the guidance of His Spirit. And when we do so, we invite His Spirit, His transformative power into our lives, to work within our lives. So here's a few practical steps. These are just outlined steps, practical things we can do to help us develop self-control. Number one, develop an awareness. Identify areas of weakness and temptation, and be discerning about those things. Don't pretend they don't exist. Set goals. Are there areas of our lives that we know need self-control, that need to be brought into the will of the Spirit, the Lord's guidance? Set goals around those things. For example, in our home, one of the things that we do with screen time is we have alarms set for our daughters and different stages of their lives, because we know that one of the things our young people struggle with today is screen time. I mentioned to you last week that a lot of teens today, the average is 8 or 9 hours a day scrolling social media. 8 or 9 hours a day for the average teen. So we set limits, we set goals for our children. And those limits are based on how old they are. And what we do is we go in and we program, hey, you're only allowed so much YouTube time, so much social media time per day. And when they hit that limit, the phone goes off. Set goals in your lives. This is just an example, but if there are areas that you struggle in self-control, set things around, fences, goals, barriers to help you, to make it more difficult to engage in certain types of activities. Set healthy habits. There are things that you know trigger your temper or your emotions. Form habits around these so that you're not left open like a city without walls. If there are things in our lives that we know when we go to these things, they automatically invoke this response, and it's not a response that honors God, make the barrier of entry more difficult. It might be blocking certain websites. Or like I mentioned, setting limits, constraints of time on our day. One of the things I think about is how much time we waste in a day. Just sitting there, zoning out, not doing anything, not thinking, the TV's on, the radio's on, something's on, and we're distracted in our lives. As Christians, we need to be very careful about how we use our time. Not just what we're engaging in, but what are we doing in our idle time? And what could we be doing with our time that would serve the Lord and that would honor Him? So set habits around areas that we know are challenging for us. Make it to where those things are more difficult. Make it to where it sets reminders that how could I better be using my time right now? I think one of the things that we struggle with in our culture, and I'm not any different, is self-control. I think it's important. And I believe it's one of the things, as Peter mentions, that hinder our growth in the Lord when we lack self-control. Peter mentions that these are qualities that we should add to our faith. It's a gift of the Spirit, but it requires effort on our part to be intentional and disciplined. Developing self-control requires a deliberate effort, but it's not one that we walk alone. Because as we seek to honor God in our lives, we participate with the Spirit who is working in our lives.